I'm here concerned with the bigger picture of human variation. Now, every so often, we're going to have to dive into those meiosis things a little bit, but I'm more concerned about the specific application of this to our human populations and what is perhaps different, I believe, about an anthropological approach to evolution than perhaps some of you have been exposed to in your biology classes and things like that. So here we go. The key issue to keep in mind for this chapter, let's say if we think about anything or keep ourselves focused on this, is one they introduced to us basically at the very beginning of the chapter, although then a little caption, and at the very middle of the chapter where we started with these statements. So we know from a scientific perspective that humans are genetically very similar, or so genetically similar, as they say. Let's just say in some ways, from a genetic point of view, we're extremely closely related to each other. We're not exactly cousins, but we're pretty darn close to all being cousins. How does it say that humans, I want to emphasize this, human beings are one continuous interbreeding species. All through our species range, from the tallest to the shortest, from the biggest to the smallest, from the lactose most intolerant to the most lactose tolerant. When you get people together who are of reproductive age and capacity from any different populations of human beings, they can reproduce with each other, and their offspring will also be able to reproduce. We are a perfect example of a single interbreeding species across our range, and we've been that for at least 200 or 300,000 years, maybe longer, but a good couple 100,000 years. So that's one key point about us. As our authors state, genetically speaking, we don't differ that much. It's like one little coding per thousand, 99.9% the same, genetically speaking. So we're one interbreeding species. We're basically all the same genetically. We also have what they call a penchant. We move around a lot. And this, again, has been true for hundreds of thousands of years, not just in the now. This has been something that humans do. Even when we didn't have planes and boats and automobiles, we walked and we ran and we moved to different places. We migrate and we intermingle with each other. Yes, we do fight each other too, but we also intermingle with each other. One of the interesting things about human beings is they may say they hate each other and they may say they fight each other, but the next thing, they're intermingling with each other and producing viable offspring. Human beings love testing out the biological species concept. Not always nicely, but they always are doing it. So that's what we do. Now, we know this to be true scientifically, but there's also a key question. If this is all true, then what the heck? When we look at the world, what do we see? We don't have to look very far. We can look around the world, but we can just look right next to each other. And we can be like, hey, wait a second. Whoa, dude, are you trying to tell me that we are 99.9% genetically similar with everybody else in this room? Really? Right? How can people, or why can people from different places appear to be so physically different when if we put them all in the genetic stuff, they'd basically be all the same? And of course, we know, again, let me be clear, even people that look very physically different, if they're of reproductive age and want to do the reproduction thing, they can do it. So how does this happen? Now, the answer to this question, they actually hide it, at least in the first part of the chapter, they hide it in a little caption to the photo there. But it's an important quote. Relatively recent evolutionary adaptations to new and localized environmental challenges have altered our visible phenotypes. So our visible phenotypes have been relatively recently altered, in part because of evolutionary adaptations, part because, as we'll find out later in this chapter, human beings are so plastic, or we have a lot of plasticity to our environment. So if you take the same person and you raise them in a different food supply and a different sunlight regime, they'll come out looking very different. So when we look around the world and we say, oh, wait, people look so different, this has to do more with our visible phenotype than it does with a serious genetic shift. Now, to understand that, and like I said, this will be part of the next part of the chapter as well. But in this part of the chapter, we of course have to understand what a genotype is and what a phenotype is. But basically, genotype is the genetics. It's the genetic makeup. It's that CGAT stuff and all the stuff that I'm not really going to talk about that much, but it's our genetic, what I call our genetic code or whatever's going on when we look in there and do the DNA and all that jazz, right? Whereas our phenotype are the things that we see, that we can measure physically, we can actually deal with when we look around the world. So genotype, we need to, of course, go in and do some DNA analysis to understand what that is. Phenotypes, for the most part, we can just look around and start measuring people and see what we come up with. Now, the phenotype is partly an expression of genotype. So it's partly based upon whatever it is, an underlying DNA code, right? But it is also often influenced by the physical environment in which we grow up. So like I said, two people with basically the same genotype, if you raise them in very different environments, if you give them different food to eat, different protein levels, different exposure to sunlight or cold or wind, give them shoes or not give them shoes, different genes are going to express themselves and turn on and off throughout the process of development. Raise two different people at two different altitudes, for example, you'll have very different outcomes in terms of lung capacities, even though they might have the same genotype. So it's often influenced by their environment. And things like the genotype and the phenotype are especially complicated in human beings. That is to say, because of what we'll talk about, our plasticity, we are especially prone to being able to express ourselves differently phenotypically. Phenotypic variability is quite high without necessarily needing to shift around genetic. Part of this is because of culture and learned behavior, right? So we can phenotypically express ourselves differently in terms of eyesight, but because we've invented these things called glasses and contacts, right? Our genes might not be changing as much as we go along. There's not so necessary for reproductive success to have good eyesight, you might say. Now, I want to be careful there. That doesn't mean that humans aren't evolving. All creatures are evolving all the time. There's always going to be genetic change in each generation, genetic shifts. That's always happening. Now, give another caveat here. When we say evolving, we do not mean getting better and better and better. What it means is change over time. So evolution is simply the process of change over time. It is always happening. It does not mean that things are getting better or more complex. Sometimes an evolutionary change can be necessary to make things more simple. So we want to be careful here. We know that humans and other creatures were all involved in the evolutionary process. However, we don't need to see these huge genetic shifts to happen in order to have a lot of phenotypic variability. So let's start with the very important physical feature that we all look at, dimples. So they're first going to take us through some genotype and phenotype stuff. Dimples. Now, let's see. What do I want to say about these dimples? According to them, well, what would you say, those of you who know your Punnett squares, what would you say about dimples according to them? What do we see here with dimples? Pretty likely. Why are dimples likely? The human population, yes. It's the dominant trait they want to say. So there's your classic you Punnett square. So let's say you have a parent. Well, let's look over here at this parent. We only have, this parent here is going to have two little d's for no dimples, right? Because we each have those two gametes each, one from each parent. So his or her parent probably had all little d's, maybe, I don't know. And then parent A here has a dominant but also a recessive. And so their kids are likely to look like this, maybe if they had 4 children, that's how things might short out. But of course, you never know. They might have 4 children that get this. It's random here, but yeah, the dimple is supposed to be dominant, right? And the dimple is dominant here. So, wait a second. Some of you had some questions here. Just terminology. Homozygous and heterozygous just means homo means the same-sex marriage. Heterozygous means different, hetero, right? And so that's just all it means is one gene is coding for dimples, big D, and one gene is not coding for dimples, little d. So if you're homozygous, you have the little d's. And if you're heterozygous, you have the D, little d, and big D. In a biology class a long time ago, we probably all had to learn these, but why? Did they ever tell you why you were learning them? No whys? All right, folks, here we go. That's why we're in anthropology. First of all, Punnett squares help us understand the mechanisms of inheritance, which is to say that inheritance comes to us as discrete traits, little units. It's not blended together. And the thing is that when Charles Darwin was coming up with his ideas, he did not understand the mechanisms of inheritance. People knew that children roughly resembled their parents, so they could tell that something was heritable or inherited from parent to child, but they didn't know how that worked. And they thought it was like mixing paint together. Like let's say you have white paint and pink paint, and you mix it together, or red paint, and you get pink paint. They thought it was all blended together. So if inheritance, however, was blended together like that, what would happen? Your variation in each generation would actually be washed out, you might say, because all the traits would just get blended together. And so importantly, over there in a monastery, think Austria, Gregory Mendel was doing his pea plants. Now, Mendel and Darwin never met each other and they never communicated. And so their work was developed independently. But Mendel was giving us some of the principles of inheritance. He didn't know about DNA, but he did discover this idea that when you had these heterozygous mixes of, say, the tall pea plants and the short pea plants, you could have that variation be preserved and come out in the next generation. And so variation and diversity is extremely important to the process of evolution. If you don't have variation or diversity, you don't have any change over time, you don't have any evolution. And getting those recessive genes in there or keeping them around can preserve variation. It also means that these traits can recombine and combine independently of each other. In other words, they don't come together as a package, right? You're not going to get a package of traits. You're going to get an independent combination of traits based upon certain loci, that places on the genetic code. Again, if traits came together as a blended package, it would wash out the variation and diversity, which is necessary for evolution. So that's why the Punnett squares are so important, not necessarily because of doing the math of them, but because it gives us a sense of what inheritance was really like. Like I said, Darwin and Mendel didn't know each other, but later on in, say, the 1940s and 1950s, people combined their work to create what is called the modern synthesis, the modern evolutionary synthesis, or some people call it neo-Darwinian evolution, which is combining the principles that Darwin gave us, the idea of natural selection, with the principles that Mendel gave us, the idea of discrete inheritance. That wasn't combined when they were alive. Later on, people brought their work together to give us what we study today in our biology classes, which is the modern synthesis of evolution. So, like I said, that is complicated enough just doing the dimples and the dominant and recessive and the Punnett squares, but there's an additional issue with human beings, which is that in human beings, as our textbook says, many traits are determined by a much more complex process than a single gene with only 2 alleles. So they wanted to tell us about dimples, and we got the dominant dimples and the recessive no dimples, and then that'll determine whether you have dimples or not. But for the most part in human beings, most of our traits are more complicated than that. In fact, they say that in most phenotypes, what do we see? We have a big word for this. Most phenotypes actually rely on more, are contributed to by more than one gene. That's what poly means, of course, more than one or multiple genes acting. To the extent that there's another big word that they use here. It's not just polygenic, it's multifactorial, which means many different factors, both genes and environment, interacting to produce these things. Now, a couple of you said that you read this sentence and you read it a few times and you'll never be able to understand it. And I agree with you because it's really complicated, right? Our traits that we see, stuff like skin color, hair color, all kinds of our physical features are actually polygenic and multifactorial. They're contributed to by various genes and various things go into this on the environment. And just to add a little complication, what happens during the reproductive process is weird and sounded funny. You talk to us about crossing over. There are some genes like all of a sudden they're on one spot and they decide to cross over to the other spot. Sounds like they're being trans genes or something, I don't know, crossing over without me knowing it. So anyway, a minor factor here, but the fact of the matter is, genetics is really complicated. It's a lot more complicated than most of us have been taught in our biology classes, at least this far, especially when it comes to human beings. We're always doing all these things with our genes. And I was really interested in this dimples thing, because I thought to myself, dimples, are you sure that's a one gene trait that's either dominant or recessive? Because I have to say, when I was growing up, they tried to tell us that brown eyes were dominant and blue eyes were recessive. And that was it. But you know what? It turns out that eye color is also polygenic and multifactorial. And it turns out that almost all human traits are polygenic and multifactorial. Look this up on Wikipedia, with the exception of a few fairly rare diseases. Sickle cell trait is one of those we'll talk about in the next part of the chapter that is not as polygenic. But for the most part, most of the things we see physically are influenced by multiple genes. And when I looked up this whole dimples thing, in fact, as far as I can tell, I know this is probably too small for you to read. When it comes to cheek dimples, it is not just as simple as dominant and recessive. In fact, there can be two people, parents who both have dimples and their kids don't necessarily have dimples, so that's weird. And then you have, as they say here, there are people who have dimples to start out with, but then they grow out of them. And there are other people who start out not having dimples, but have them later on. And then they finally say, because the inheritance of pattern of cheek dimples can be unpredictable, some researchers classify them as an irregular dominant trait. So your textbook in this case gives us the idea that it is dominant and recessive, although they qualify that a little bit. But I would say even with dimples, it's an irregular dominant trait. And kind of dominant, but not exactly. And it's environmentally influenced, or it seems to be something that changes over time. So, point of this first part here is that genotype and phenotype are much more complex than most of us have been taught already in high school. The Punnett squares and inheritance is very important, but it might even be more complicated than what you've learned in your textbook.